Part 6. Dialectical Materialism and Ideologies. Section 1. The application of the dialectical method to ideologies. Of what importance are ideologies for Marxism? We are accustomed to hearing that Marxism is a materialist philosophy that denies the role of ideas in history. Denying the role of the ideological factor, it only considers economic influences. This is false. Marxism does not deny the important role of the mind, of art, or of ideas in life. Quite to the contrary, it attaches a particular importance to these ideological forms. We are going to end this study of the elementary principles of Marxism by explaining how the method of dialectical materialism may be applied to ideologies. We shall see what the role of ideologies in history, i.e. the influence of the ideological factor, is, and what ideological forms are. This part of Marxism that we are about to study is the least known part of this philosophy. The reason for this is that, for a long time, attention has been centered on the part of Marxism that deals with political economy. As a result, this subject has been arbitrarily separated, not only from the great whole which Marxism forms, but from its very foundation. For what enabled political economy to become a true science was historical materialism, which is, as we have seen, an application of dialectical materialism. We might point out, parenthetically, that this manner of proceeding derives from the metaphysical spirit which we have so much trouble ridding ourselves of. It is, let us repeat, to the extent that we isolate things and study them unilaterally, that we commit mistakes. Incorrect interpretations of Marxism derive, therefore, from the fact that the role of ideologies in history and in life has not been sufficiently underlined. Ideologies have been separated from Marxism. As a result, Marxism has been separated from dialectical materialism, that is to say, from itself. We are happy to see that, in recent years, thanks in part to the work of the Workers' University in Paris, through which several thousands of students have come to know Marxism, and thanks also to the work of our intellectual comrades who have contributed to the cause through their work and their books, Marxism has regained its true character and the place which belongs to it. What is an ideology? The ideological factor and ideological forms. We shall open this chapter, which is dedicated to the role of ideologies, with a few definitions. What do we call an ideology? Ideology implies, above all, ideas. Ideology is a collection of ideas that form a whole, a theory, a system, or even at times simply a state of mind. Marxism is an ideology that forms a whole and that offers a method of resolving all problems. A Republican ideology is the collection of ideas that we find in the mind of a Republican. By Republican is understood someone who supports a republic rather than a monarchy. But an ideology is not only a collection of pure ideas, supposedly void of any feeling. This is a metaphysical concept. An ideology necessarily includes feelings, likes, dislikes, hopes, fears, etc. In the proletarian ideology, we find the ideal elements of class struggle, but we also find feelings of solidarity with those who are exploited by the capitalist system, with the imprisoned, as well as feelings of revolt, of enthusiasm, etc. All of these elements make up an ideology. Now, let us see what is meant by the ideological factor. This is ideology considered as a cause or a force that acts, which is capable of exerting influence. This is why one speaks of the influence of the ideological factor. Religions, for example, are an ideological factor of which we must take account. They have a moral force of considerable influence. What is an ideological form? This term designates a collection of particular ideas which form an ideology in a specialized field. Religion and ethics are forms of ideology, as are science, philosophy, literature, art, and poetry. Hence, if we want to examine the role of the history of ideology in general, and of all its forms in particular, we must conduct our study not by separating ideology from history, i.e. from the life of society, but by determining the role of ideology, its factors and forms, in and beginning with society. Economic structure and ideological structure. In our study of historical materialism, we saw that the history of societies may be explained in the following sequence. Men make history by their actions, the expression of their will. The latter is determined by their ideas. We have seen that what explains men's ideas, i.e. their ideology, is the social milieu in which we find classes, themselves determined by the economic factor, i.e. in the last analysis by the mode of production. We have also seen that between the ideological factor and the social factor there is the political factor, which appears in the ideological struggle as the expression of the social struggle. If, then, we examine the structure of society in the light of historical materialism, we see that its foundation is the economic structure. Then, above it, there is the social structure, which supports the political structure, and finally, the ideological structure. We see that, for materialists, the ideological structure is at the top of the social edifice, while for idealists, the ideological structure is at its base. Quote, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. End quote. Consequently, we see that it is the economic structure that forms the foundation of society. We might also say that it is the infrastructure, which means inferior or lower structure. Ideology, including all its forms, ethics, religion, science, poetry, art, and literature, constitutes the supra or superstructure, which means structure at the top. Since we know, as materialist theory shows, that ideas are the reflection of things, that it is our social existence that determines our consciousness, we may say that the superstructure is the reflection of the infrastructure. Here is an example by Engels which clearly shows this to be so. Quote, Calvin's creed was one fit for the boldest of the bourgeoisie of his time. His predestination doctrine was the religious expression of the fact that, in the commercial world of competition, success or failure does not depend upon a man's activity or cleverness, but upon circumstances uncontrollable by him. It is not of him that willeth, or of him that runneth, but of the mercy of unknown superior economic powers. And this was especially true at a period of economic revolution, when all old commercial routes and centers were replaced by new ones, when India and America were open to the world, and when even the most sacred economic articles of faith, the value of gold and silver, began to totter and to break down. End quote. What happens in the economic life of merchants? They compete with each other. Merchants and bourgeois alike have experienced this competition, in which there are victors and vanquished. Quite often, the most resourceful and intelligent are defeated by competition, by a crisis that crops up and downs them. For them, this crisis is unpredictable, a blow of fate. It is this idea that, for no apparent reason, the least clever sometimes survive crises, which is transposed in the Protestant religion. It is this observation, that some accidentally make it, which creates the idea of predestination, according to which men must submit to a fate which is fixed for all eternity by God. From this example of the reflection of economic conditions, we see how the superstructure is the reflection of the infrastructure. Here is another example. Let us take the mentality of two non-union, i.e., politically undeveloped workers. One works in a big factory where the work is rationalized, the other for a small craftsman. It is certain that both of them will have a different conception of their boss. For one, the boss will be a ferocious exploiter, characteristic of capitalism. The other will see the boss as a worker, certainly well off, but a worker and not a tyrant. It is surely the reflection of their conditions of work which will determine their conception of management. This important example causes us, in order to be precise, to make certain observations. True consciousness and false consciousness. We have just said that ideologies are the reflection of the material conditions of society, that social being determines social consciousness. One might conclude from this that the proletariat must automatically have a proletarian ideology. But such a supposition does not correspond to reality, for there are workers who do not have a worker's consciousness. Hence, we must make a distinction. People may live in certain conditions, but their consciousness of it may not correspond to reality. This is what Engels terms having a false consciousness. Example: some workers are influenced by the doctrine of corporatism, which is a return towards the Middle Ages and handicrafts. In this case, there is a consciousness of the misery of workers, but it is not a true and correct consciousness. Ideology certainly is, in this case, a reflection of the conditions of social life, but it is not a loyal or exact reflection. In people's consciousness, this reflection is often upside down. To observe the existence of misery is a reflection of social conditions, but this reflection becomes false when one thinks that a return to handicrafts would be the solution to the problem. Hence, here we see a consciousness that is partly true and partly false. The worker who is a royalist also has a consciousness that is both true and false. True because he wants to eliminate the misery that he observes. False because he thinks a king can do that. And simply because he has reasoned badly, because he has poorly chosen his ideology, this worker can become a class enemy for us, even though he belongs to our class. Thus, to have a false consciousness is to be mistaken or deceived about one's true condition. We can say, then, that ideology is the reflection of the conditions of existence, but that it is not an inevitable reflection. Moreover, we must point out that everything possible is done to give us a false consciousness and to develop the influence of the ideology of the ruling classes on the exploited classes. The first elements of a life conception that we receive, our education and instruction, give us a false consciousness. Our connections in life, a peasant background for some of us, propaganda, the press, the radio, also falsify our consciousness at times. Consequently, ideological work is of extreme importance for us as Marxists. False consciousness must be destroyed in order for us to attain a true consciousness. Without ideological work, this transformation cannot be realized. Those who consider Marxism to be a fatalistic doctrine are therefore wrong, since in reality, we believe that ideologies play a large role in society and that one must teach and learn the philosophy of Marxism so that it may become an efficient tool and weapon. Action and reaction of ideological factors. From the examples of true and false consciousness above, we have seen that we mustn't always try to explain ideas only by the economy, thereby denying that ideas exert any influence. To proceed in this way would be to interpret Marxism incorrectly. Ideas can be explained, certainly, in the last analysis, by the economy, but they also have an activity of their own. Quote, according to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggles and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. There is an interaction of all these elements in which, amid all the endless host of accidents, that is, of things and events whose inner connection is so remote or so impossible of proof that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary." End quote. Hence, we see that we must examine everything before looking for the economic factor, and that while the latter is the cause, in the last analysis, we must always remember that it is not the only cause. Ideologies are reflections and the effects of economic conditions, but the relation between the two is not simple, for we also observe a reciprocal action of ideologies on the infrastructure. If we want to study the mass movement that developed in France after February 1934, Politzer is referring to the Popular Front, a coalition of left-wing parties that came to power in France in 1936. We shall do so from two angles in order to demonstrate what we have just discussed. 1. Some explain this movement by saying that its cause was the economic crisis. This is a materialist but unilateral explanation. This explanation takes only one factor into consideration, the economic one, in this case the crisis. 2. This reasoning is therefore partly correct, but on the condition that another explanatory factor be added, what people were thinking, their ideology. Now, in this mass movement, people were anti-fascist. These feelings were due to the propaganda that gave rise to the Popular Front. But in order for this propaganda to be effective, a favorable terrain was necessary. What one was able to do in 1936 was not possible in 1932. Finally, we know how, afterwards, this mass movement and its ideology, in turn, influenced the economy by the social struggle which they inspired." End quote. Hence, in this example, we see that ideology, which is the reflection of social conditions, becomes, in turn, a cause of events. Quote, "Political, juridical, philosophical, religious, literary, artistic, etc. development is based on economic development. But all these react upon one another and also upon the economic basis. It is not that the economic situation is cause solely active, while everything else is only passive effect. There is, rather, interaction on the basis of economic necessity which ultimately asserts itself." End quote. Accordingly, quote, "The basis of the right of inheritance, assuming that the stages reached in the development of the family are the same, is an economic one. Nevertheless, it would be difficult to prove, for instance, that the absolute liberty of the testator in England and the severe restrictions in every detail imposed upon him in France are due to economic causes alone. Both react back, however, on the economic sphere to a very considerable extent because they influence the distribution of property." End quote. To cite a more contemporary example, we shall take that of taxes. We all have an idea about taxes. The rich want theirs reduced and so favor indirect taxes. Workers and the middle classes want, on the contrary, a fiscality based on direct and progressive taxation. So then, the idea that we have about taxes, and which is an ideological factor, has its origin in our economic situation, which is created and imposed by capitalism. The rich wish to keep their privileges and fight to preserve the present mode of taxation and to reinforce the laws in this direction. Now, these laws, which derive from ideas, react on the economy, for they destroy small commerce and the handicrafts and accelerate capitalist concentration. Consequently, we see that economic conditions give rise to modifications in economic conditions, and that is by taking into account this reciprocity of relations that we should examine ideologies, all ideologies. It is only in the last analysis that we see economic necessities always prevail. We know that it is the mission of writers and thinkers to propagate, if not defend, ideologies. Their thoughts and writings are not always very typical or straightforward, but, in fact, even in simple tales or stories, upon analysis we can always find an ideology. To make this type of analysis is a very delicate operation, and we must be very prudent. We are going to indicate a dialectical method of analysis which will be of great assistance, but we must be careful not to be mechanical and try to explain the unexplainable. A method of dialectical analysis. In order to apply the dialectical method properly, one must know many things. If you do not know your subject, it must be studied carefully. Otherwise, your judgment will amount to only a caricature of the truth. In order to make an analysis of a literary work, a book or story, we are going to indicate a method which may be applied to other subjects as well. A. You must first pay attention to the content of the book or story you wish to analyze. Examine it independently of any social question, for not everything is derived from class struggle or economic conditions. There are literary influences that we must take into consideration. Try to see to which literary school the work belongs. Take into account the internal development of ideologies. Practically speaking, it would be good to make a summary of the subject under analysis and to note down anything you found remarkable. B. Next, observe the social types the heroes of the intrigue belong to. Look for the class to which they belong. Examine the action of the characters and see if what takes place in the novel can be linked in some way to a social viewpoint. If this is not possible, if it cannot reasonably be done, it is better to abandon the analysis rather than invent. You must never invent an explanation. C. After you have discovered what class or classes are involved, you must determine the economic foundation, i.e., the means of production and the way of producing at the moment when the action of the novel takes place. If, for example, the action is contemporary, the economic system is capitalism. At present, we see numerous stories and novels that criticize and fight capitalism. But there are two ways to fight capitalism. One, as a revolutionary seeking to go forward, and two, as a reactionary who wants to return to the past. It is often this form which we encounter in modern novels, in which one longs for the good old days. D. Once we have obtained all of this, we can then look for the ideology, i.e., see what the ideas and feelings, the way of thinking of the author is. While searching for the ideology, we shall keep in mind the role it plays, its influence on the minds of those who read the book. E. We can then conclude our analysis by saying why such a story or novel was written at such a moment, and criticize or praise, according to the case, the author's intentions, often unconscious. This method of analysis can be effective only if one remembers, while applying it, everything that has been said previously. We must remember that dialectics, while it provides us with a new way of conceiving things, also demands that we know them well in order to discuss and analyze them. Consequently, now that we have seen what our method consists of, we must try in our studies and in our personal and militant lives to see things in their motion, in their changes, in their contradictions, and in their historical significance, and not in a static, immobile state. We must try to study them as well in all their aspects and not unilaterally. In short, we must always try to apply the dialectical spirit everywhere. The necessity of ideological struggle. We know better now what dialectical materialism is, the modern form of materialism founded by Marx and Engels and developed by Lenin. In the present work, we have made particular use of texts by Marx and Engels, but we cannot end this course without pointing out that the philosophical work of Lenin is also considerable. This is why today we speak of Marxism-Leninism. Marxism-Leninism and dialectical materialism are inseparably united. Only through the knowledge of dialectical materialism can one measure the entire scope and wealth of Marxism-Leninism. This leads us to the conclusion that the militant is not truly armed ideologically unless he is familiar with the entirety of this doctrine. Having understood this, the bourgeoisie attempts to introduce, by any means, its own ideology into the consciousness of workers. Knowing perfectly well that, of all the aspects of Marxism-Leninism, it is dialectical materialism that is, at present, least known, the bourgeoisie has organized a campaign of silence against it. It is painful to note that the official instruction is oblivious to this method, and that teaching methodology in schools and universities has not changed in the last 100 years. If, formerly, the metaphysical method dominated the dialectical method, this was due, as we have seen, to the ignorance of people. Today, science has provided us with a means to demonstrate that the dialectical method is most suitable to scientific research. It is scandalous that our children continue to be taught how to think and study with a method born of ignorance. While in their scientific research, scientists can no longer study in their specializations without taking into account the inner penetration of the sciences, in this way unconsciously utilizing a part of dialectics. Too often they apply the intellectual training given to them, and which is infused with the metaphysical spirit. How much progress would have been realized by those great scientists who have already contributed to humanity? For example, Pasteur and Branly, who were idealists and believers, if they had a dialectical training. But there is a form of struggle against Marxism-Leninism that is even more dangerous than this campaign of silence. Namely, those distortions that the bourgeoisie tries to organize even within the workers' movement. At this moment, we witness the blossoming of numerous theoreticians who claim to be Marxists and who pretend to be renewing or rejuvenating Marxism. Campaigns of this nature often choose for their foundation those aspects of Marxism that are least known, in particular materialist philosophy. Thus, for example, there are people who claim to accept Marxism as a concept of revolutionary action, but not as a general conception of the world. They maintain that one can be perfectly Marxist without accepting materialist philosophy. In conformity with this general attitude, divisive attempts at adulteration occur. People who still call themselves Marxists try to introduce into Marxism concepts that are incompatible with its very foundation, namely materialist philosophy. We have seen such attempts in the past. It was against them that Lenin wrote Materialism and Imperial Criticism. At the present time, in a period of large diffusion of Marxism, we are witnessing the rebirth and multiplication of these attempts. How can we expect to recognize and uncover those who attack Marxism in its philosophical aspect if we do not know the true philosophy of Marxism? Conclusion. Fortunately, for several years now, and in the working class in particular, we have observed a tremendous thrust towards the study of the whole of Marxism, and a growing interest precisely in the study of materialist philosophy. This is clearly an indication that, in the present situation, the working class has perfectly understood the justice of the reasons that we gave in the beginning for studying materialist philosophy. Through their own experience, workers have learned the necessity of linking practice to theory, and at the same time the necessity of extending theoretical study as far as possible. The role of every militant must be to reinforce this tendency and to give it a proper direction and content. We are happy to see that, thanks to the Workers' University in Paris, several thousand have learned what dialectical materialism is. While this illustrates in a striking manner our struggle against the bourgeoisie and shows us which side science is on, it also shows us our duty. We must study. We must know and make Marxism known in all circles. Parallel with the struggle in the streets and at work, militants must lead an ideological struggle. Their duty is to defend our ideology against all forms of attack and, at the same time, to lead the counteroffensive for the destruction of the bourgeois ideology in the consciousness of workers. But in order to dominate all aspects of this struggle, we must be armed. The militant can truly be armed only through the knowledge of dialectical materialism. Until we have constructed a classless society in which nothing will thwart the development of science, such is the essential part of our duty. End of book.